My children, watching me as I lay dying, thought I couldn't hear them laughing behind my back. They thought I was blind, that I didn't see the new curtains, the expensive watch, and the bank account emptied without my permission. They had found a copy of the will and had already begun dividing up my life while I was still breathing. But they didn't know the real paper wasn't in the house. It was in an old box with my army dog tag, kept by the man who once saved my life in the jungle. I wasn't dying. I was waiting for them to show their true faces. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Harold Whitmore. I was 76 years old that winter, and I felt every year of it in my knees, in my spine, and in the way I breathed when I climbed the 2 steps up to my porch. I lived alone in a small town in Iowa, in the same single-story house where my wife and I had raised 2 children and buried a 3rd. I was a retired mechanic. Before that, I was a platoon sergeant in Vietnam. And before that, just a quiet boy who believed life had a straight path, lined with effort and reward. The snow came early that year. By the 1st of November, the streets were already buried under a thick, stubborn crust, and my old shovel leaned by the door like a forgotten friend. The air was dry and sharp, and the windows of my house moaned at night when the wind pressed against them. I used to like winter when I was younger. It meant silence, warmth by the fire, and time to reflect. But that year, it felt more like a wait. It was the first winter since Martha passed, and the rooms of the house echoed differently without her steps. I had been waking up before sunrise most days, just to sit at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and the local paper. Not to read the news, I stopped believing in that a long time ago, but to feel some kind of rhythm to the days. The paper boy, always late. The heater, groaning to life at 6:15 sharp. The birds gone. The deer tracks near the shed. Everything followed its pattern, except for my body, which began to betray me in small, quiet ways. My fingers ached longer in the mornings. My balance shifted without warning. The tools in my garage felt heavier, as though some unseen force was trying to pull them from my grip. My children hadn't called in weeks. That wasn't unusual. We were never the kind of family that said too much. After Martha died, they started visiting less. First once a week, then once a month. Now I couldn't remember the last time either of them stayed longer than a quick coffee. Brian was always talking about work, real estate, deals, timing. Cindy had her hands full with the kids and a husband who I suspected barely remembered my name. Still, I didn't blame them. That was the kind of thing you expected when you got old. Distance, polite silence, slow forgetting. But that winter felt different. It wasn't just the cold, or the aching bones, or the empty rooms. It was the way I caught Brian looking at the house last time he visited. Not looking at me, but at the walls, the cabinets, the furniture, calculating, measuring, as if he were already rearranging it in his mind, taking down the old photographs and putting up whatever style was popular now in those catalogs he always left on the counter when he thought I wasn't watching. I had seen that look before, back when I helped a widow sell her late husband's auto shop. It was the look of someone preparing for a future that didn't include the present. And then, there was the file. I had kept it in the top drawer of my bedroom dresser, beneath a stack of Martha's old greeting cards and some faded war photos. It was just a draft, unsigned and unstamped, a practice run for my will. I had printed it months ago, thinking I'd get around to the real thing eventually. I'd left it there because it didn't matter to me at the time. But now, it mattered. Because one morning, it wasn't exactly where I had left it. The stack was neater. The drawer pulled out an inch more than usual, and when I checked, there were fresh fingerprints on the manila envelope. I recognized the shape of Brian's hands in the way the contents were pressed down. He had found it. I sat down that evening in the living room with the envelope in my lap. Outside, the wind howled across the fields. Snow curled up against the fence posts like sleeping animals. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel fear. I felt something older than both. Weariness. Not of the body, but of the heart. A kind of exhaustion that came from being seen not as a man, but as a wallet in waiting. A name attached to a house. A number in a bank. There was a photograph on the mantel. Me, in uniform, 19 years old, dirt on my cheek and fire in my eyes. I looked at that face and wondered what he would think of the man I had become, the choices I had made, the silence I now lived in. That boy would have been furious. That boy hadn't known yet what family could turn into. He hadn't sat through Christmas dinners where smiles meant nothing and every toast was a performance. He hadn't buried a wife and watched the children fold up her memory like an old coat. I put the photo back and went to the garage. The cold bit through my sweater. I turned on the old work light above the bench and looked around at the tools I had collected over decades. Everything had a place. Every drawer, every socket, every wrench. I had built a life of order, of function, of fixing broken things. But what do you do when what's broken can't be fixed? That night, I didn't sleep much. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the furnace cycle on and off. In my mind, I walked through the rooms of the house, remembering where every board creaked, where every photo used to hang. I thought about Martha's laugh, how it echoed in the hallway. I thought about the time I carried Brian on my shoulders through a blizzard to get to the pharmacy when he had a fever. I thought about Cindy's 5th birthday, the pink cake that fell off the table, and how she cried until I drew a new one in frosting on a plate. They remembered none of that. Or they remembered only what suited them. Morning came, gray and slow. I opened the curtain and looked out over the yard. The snow had stopped. The branches of the maple tree sparkled with ice. Everything looked clean, untouched. But I knew better. I knew winter didn't mean peace. It just meant cover. That was the last winter of my name. Not because I would die soon. No. But because I could feel the moment coming when the name Harold Whitmore would stop meaning father, husband, man, and start meaning asset, property, estate. They didn't know I was watching, but I was, and I remembered everything. It began with a sound, barely a sound, really. The soft creak of wood, slow and tentative, as if someone was trying not to disturb the dust. It came from down the hallway, muffled by carpet and walls. I had been resting in my recliner, eyes closed but not asleep, listening to the hush of the house settle around me. The heater had just kicked off, and the sudden silence made every other sound in the house stand out, like a crack in glass. That's when I heard the drawer. The top drawer of my dresser had a peculiar squeak to it, sharp at the start, dragging in the middle, and then a little pop at the end when it hit the stop. I recognized it immediately. It was a sound I'd made 1,000 times over the years, retrieving socks, loose change, old birthday cards from Martha, and lately, the draft of the will I'd written and forgotten about. I hadn't heard that drawer in weeks, but now, in the middle of a quiet Sunday afternoon, it opened and closed twice in succession. I waited a moment, then got up slowly, careful with my back. I made noise on purpose, clearing my throat, pushing the chair back hard enough to scrape the floor, just enough for whoever was down the hall to hear me coming. By the time I reached the bedroom, the door was open, and the room empty. The sunlight filtered through the blinds in soft slats across the dresser, and the drawer sat slightly ajar, an inch maybe, like a mouth that hadn't finished its sentence. I didn't check it right away. Instead, I walked around the bed, pulled the curtain back, and looked out at the front yard, where Brian's truck was parked crookedly along the curb. The engine was still ticking with heat. I turned back to the dresser. My hand went to the drawer, pulled it open. Everything was where I had left it. but different, neater, straighter. The manila folder was pressed flat, its edges smoothed out like someone had run their hands over it multiple times. I flipped it open. The will draft was there, exactly as before. My name at the top, a list of assets, and the names of my children under the heading Primary Beneficiaries. No signature, no witness line filled out. Just a document, harmless on its own. But it was no longer untouched. A week later, the change began. At first, it was subtle. Brian started showing up more often, always with an excuse: a broken faucet, a concern about the roof, a question about the snowblower. He'd linger around the house longer than necessary, poking into corners, commenting on how the furnace sure was old, or how the wiring might need updating soon if you're not careful. He'd drift into my bedroom when he thought I was busy in the garage. I could hear him moving around, opening drawers again, slower this time, like someone who already knew what they were looking for. Cindy called the next day. She hadn't phoned in a month before that. Her voice was too sweet, too careful. She asked about my blood pressure, my memory, my sleep. Then she asked if I had ever considered moving into a smaller place, something easier to manage. I said no, and she said, "Just thinking ahead, Daddy." The way she said Daddy made my stomach turn. That was the voice she used on her kids when she wanted them to agree to something without thinking. 2 days later, I caught Brian in the hallway, holding the manila folder. He tried to smile like nothing had happened, but his hands were tense. He handed it back to me and said, "Thought I'd help you organize some stuff." He was too old to believe that kind of lie himself, but too used to telling it. I took the folder and said nothing. He left a few minutes later. After that, things accelerated. I began noticing changes around the house that I hadn't approved or even known about. New rugs replaced my worn-out but familiar ones. The curtains in the living room were switched for something that looked like it came out of a catalog. My recliner was moved, twice. I moved it back, but the message was already there. They were preparing, not for me to die, not really, but for my absence, for a version of life in which I no longer occupied this house. The bank account was next. I checked it online, something I rarely did, and saw withdrawals I hadn't made. Small at first, then bolder, 1,000 here, 600 there, all marked as household expenses. When I asked Brian about it, he waved it off, said he'd been fronting some maintenance costs and would handle it. I didn't argue. I let it sit. I wanted to see how far they'd go. Cindy arrived that weekend with bags of groceries I hadn't asked for, and a binder of brochures, assisted living facilities, private care options, all with smiling senior citizens on the cover, and glossy photos of neatly made beds. She left them on the table like menus at a restaurant. Her eyes didn't meet mine. She said she had to pick up the kids and left in a hurry. I didn't touch the brochures. I didn't even open them. They were still on the table the next morning, gathering dust like tombstones in the sun. I spent most of that week in silence, watching them make plans around me. I overheard Cindy on the phone with someone, her husband probably, saying, "If we play it right, we won't have to wait long. He's already slowing down." Brian, meanwhile, began bringing over a contractor friend, supposedly to look at repairs. But I knew better. They weren't fixing my house. They were measuring it. One evening, I opened the dresser again and looked at the folder. I took the papers out, studied them. The font looked juvenile now, the terms vague. It was never a real will, just a placeholder. But to them, it was gospel. They believed it. That's what frightened me more than anything, the certainty. They had seen something on paper and decided it was theirs. They didn't ask. They didn't wait. They just began acting like the end had already come. I stood there with the folder in my hands, and I remembered Vietnam, not the fighting, but the waiting. The long days when the jungle didn't move, and you could feel danger in the air without hearing a sound. That's how it felt now, like the house had become a field of quiet threats, and every drawer, every glance, every word had to be interpreted carefully. Nothing was casual anymore. They had found the papers on the dresser, and in doing so, they had revealed who they truly were. I didn't throw the folder away. I didn't move it. I left it exactly where they had found it. Let them keep looking. Let them believe they knew the plan, because the real plan lived elsewhere, and I was just getting started. It started with a delivery truck, a small white box truck that pulled into the driveway one afternoon, just as I was about to step outside to salt the front steps. It blocked the whole view from the window, so close to the porch it nearly touched the handrail. A man in a padded vest and branded cap jumped down, opened the back, and began unloading a massive television, bigger than anything I'd ever seen. I stood there watching, motionless, as he wheeled it up to the door and knocked like this happened every day. Brian met him at the threshold. I hadn't even known Brian was in the house. He signed for it, smiled, and said something to the delivery man that made both of them laugh. They wheeled the box inside, past the living room, through the hallway, and into what used to be the den. My den. My space. They set it down where my old bookshelf had stood, the one with Martha's gardening books and my dog-eared service manuals. Now there was just a blank wall, waiting for the screen. When I asked what it was for, Brian waved a receipt in the air and said he found a deal. I asked how much it cost. He said it didn't matter. It was just part of what's coming anyway. That was the first time I heard the phrase, just part of what's coming, like my life had already expired and my body just hadn't caught up yet. Within days, the spending became a rhythm, like rain on a roof. A new stainless steel refrigerator arrived, then a smart thermostat I didn't understand. They replaced the perfectly good stove with one that had touch controls and glowed blue when you turned it on. The couch in the living room vanished, and a sleek leather sectional took its place. Cindy bought new dishes, silver-trimmed with gold accents. They were too fancy to eat off, but she said they were aesthetic. I didn't ask what that meant. I just nodded and watched her fill the kitchen drawers with utensils I'd never seen before. Things shaped like they belonged in a dentist's office, not a kitchen. Every change came with the same explanation. Just upgrading what'll be ours soon. The words hit like slow punches to the gut. They said it with grins, with that breezy entitlement that made my skin crawl. Like I wasn't supposed to notice, like I wasn't supposed to care. My credit card bills began arriving in thicker envelopes. Charges I didn't recognize appeared in bold. Online retailers, furniture stores, spa packages, flights I never took. I called the bank and asked for the statements to be printed and mailed to me. The woman on the phone hesitated before asking, gently, if someone else in the family had access to my accounts. I told her yes. I didn't tell her how much I regretted that now. Brian must have found out I'd been monitoring the statements, because the next week, he changed the account's online password. When I asked, he brushed it off, said it was for security. That word had lost all meaning to me by then. Nothing in my life felt secure anymore. I noticed small things disappearing. My toolbox in the garage wasn't as full as it had been. The antique radio I kept by the window was gone. A pocket knife I'd carried since the war vanished from the nightstand. When I asked Cindy if she'd seen it, she smiled too widely and said she was sure it would turn up. It never did. They started inviting people over. Friends, colleagues, strangers. They gave tours of the house while I sat silently in the corner, like a relic on display. I overheard Brian describing my bedroom as perfect for conversion into an office. Cindy told someone she planned to open up the space by knocking down the wall between the dining room and the kitchen. They spoke as though I wasn't there, as though I was furniture, or worse, already gone. Then came the appraisal. A man in a tie arrived one morning, clipboard in hand, and walked through my home taking notes. He opened every door, peered into closets, crawled through the attic. He asked questions about the foundation, the roof, the plumbing. Brian answered all of them. I said nothing. I knew what this was. They were preparing to sell the house. I stopped eating with them. I took my meals in the garage or on the back porch when it wasn't too cold. They didn't notice. Or if they did, they didn't care. The house no longer smelled like mine. The kitchen no longer sounded like mine. The whole place had been stripped of its soul and stuffed with receipts. One afternoon, I walked past the guest room and saw Cindy packing boxes. My boxes. She was going through my papers, old letters, tax records, photographs. I watched from the hallway. She didn't see me. She picked up a framed picture of Martha and me on our wedding day, looked at it for half a second, then placed it face down in a pile with others. That image stayed with me longer than I expected, not because she touched it, but because of how lightly she dismissed it. Later that week, they sat me down in the living room and said they wanted to help me prepare for next steps. Brian had drawn up a list: facilities, care homes, tranquil communities. Cindy had printed glossy brochures again, all smiling faces and green lawns. I didn't touch them. I didn't say a word. They mistook my silence for surrender. The irony was that I didn't fear death. I'd come close enough to it in the jungle to know what it felt like. But this wasn't death. This was erasure. A slow, humiliating evaporation of everything I'd built, everything I'd saved, everything I'd believed would matter to them someday. But the worst came when they used my own savings to prepay for my transition. That was the word Brian used. Transition. As if I were being moved to another room, not buried. He showed me a receipt. Thousands of dollars transferred out of my account to a facility I'd never seen. He looked proud, like he'd done me a favor. That night, I sat in the garage, the only part of the house that still felt like mine. The air was cold, the concrete hard beneath my feet. I stared at my old oil-stained workbench, the tools that remained, the shelves lined with bolts, wires, screws collected over decades. Each item had a story. Each drawer had a purpose. I reached for a small cigar box on the top shelf. Inside it were Martha's letters from her first year's teaching, a photograph of my platoon, and a worn envelope addressed to someone who had once called me brother. It was still sealed, and it wasn't addressed to Brian. I placed the envelope back, gently, and closed the box. They thought they had won. They didn't know they'd been spending someone else's future, one that no longer belonged to them. Not in writing, not in truth, not anymore. I had kept the box tucked away for years, buried beneath a layer of old moving blankets and rusted garden tools in the back corner of the garage. The lid was dented, the hinges stiff, and the metal had dulled to a tired gray. But I knew the shape of it by heart. My hands found it without needing light. I hadn't opened it since the year Martha died. Not because I feared what was inside, but because I thought I wouldn't need it anymore. I had convinced myself that the past had done its job, and the future, such as it was, would be quiet. I was wrong. The day I returned to the box, the snow outside had turned to slush. A wet wind came down from the northwest and rattled the windows like impatient fingers. The house was filled with movement again. Brian upstairs, making calls I wasn't supposed to hear. Cindy rearranging the living room for the third time. I slipped away unnoticed, into the cold, dim belly of the garage, where memory waited in the dust. The latch squeaked when I opened it. Inside, the contents were exactly as I'd left them. My old service jacket, the fabric thin and fraying along the seams. A faded American flag folded into a neat triangle. A canteen with dents like fingerprints, and beneath all of that, at the very bottom, a yellowing envelope wrapped in twine. The paper had gone soft at the corners, and the ink was beginning to fade, but the name on the front was still legible. Jack Milner. The only man who ever pulled me out of fire without hesitation. We had served together in Quang Tri Province, in a stretch of jungle so thick you could barely see the sky. He was from Montana, had a drawl so slow it sounded like honey, and eyes like flint. We weren't friends in the way people mean now. No social calls, no family photos, no shared birthday parties. We were bonded by silence, by survival, by the knowledge that we had seen the worst of each other and chosen to live anyway. I had written him a letter 5 years ago, not long after Martha passed. I told him I was getting my affairs in order, that I didn't trust lawyers or even my own blood anymore, that I needed a second set of hands, steady, quiet, honorable. He had written back in words that were few, but final. "I'll hold it. No one else touches it. Just say when." Inside the envelope was the true will, not a draft, not a thought exercise, the real thing, signed, notarized, witnessed. I had paid a lawyer in Cedar Rapids to help me draw it up, paid in cash, used a P.O. box, never filed it with the county. That will left nothing to Brian or Cindy, not because I didn't love them once, but because they had shown me that love to them was just leverage. Instead, I had named Jack as executor, and the beneficiaries were a foundation for disabled veterans, a local vocational school in my wife's name, and a small group of people whose names I knew from quiet acts of kindness. A mail carrier who once shoveled my walkway without being asked, a nurse who stayed after her shift to sit with Martha, a boy from the neighborhood who brought in my trash bins every Thursday. That piece of paper was my final word. I read it again in the light of the garage, the fluorescent bulb above humming like a wasp. My hands trembled, not from fear or weakness, but from the weight of it. I had never liked paperwork. Too many lines, too many empty spaces that people could twist. But this page, this one page, was more solid than stone. It was the only thing left that hadn't been corrupted by expectation or assumption. I placed the will back in the envelope, wrapped the twine again, and slid it into a smaller lockbox, one that I bolted to the underside of the workbench. Then I wrote Jack a letter. No phone call, no email, just a letter, like we used to send from jungle outposts when the radios were dead and the nights were too loud to sleep. I told him it was time. I didn't explain why. He didn't need reasons. I mailed the letter the next morning from the post office in the next town over. I took back roads to get there, wore a hat I hadn't worn in years, parked far from the door. It felt ridiculous, almost theatrical, but part of me enjoyed the cloak and dagger of it. Let them think I was senile. Let them smile when I confused the days of the week or paused too long in a sentence. They didn't know I was 5 steps ahead. They didn't know I'd been preparing for this for longer than they'd been pretending to care. When I returned home, Brian was in the backyard, walking a man in a blazer around the property, pointing at the trees, the fence, the shed. I recognized the look on his face, polished, calculated, the same look I used to see on salesmen when I was still running the garage. He caught my eye but didn't wave, just turned and kept walking. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table and went through the drawers. I gathered all the fake documents they had seen, the draft will, the old insurance papers, the outdated bank statements, and I organized them neatly in a file labeled Important. I left it half open in the desk drawer. Bait. Upstairs, Cindy was pacing on the phone, her voice muffled by walls but still sharp enough to pierce through. I caught words here and there. Listing, inspection, fast track, signatures. The future was already being sold in pieces, but what they didn't realize was that I had reclaimed my present. Jack's reply came 5 days later. A plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 6 words. Got it. I'll be ready, always. I burned the note in the fireplace, not out of secrecy, but out of ritual. It felt appropriate, like a final salute between men who knew better than to leave loose ends. That night, I slept well for the first time in months. The house was still too warm, still filled with strangers pretending to be family, but I no longer felt cornered. I had a phantom on my side now, not a ghost, not a memory, but a man who had walked through fire with me, and who carried the truth in his hands. Let them keep spending. They thought the money was already theirs. But what they were spending was borrowed time. The first time they brought company over, it was a Tuesday. A cold, windless Tuesday, with the sky the color of unwashed cotton and the air too still for January. I had been sitting at the window, watching a cardinal peck at the dry husk of a sunflower stalk, when I heard tires crunching in the driveway. I recognized neither the vehicle nor the voices that followed. They entered laughing, loud and casual, with the cadence of people who thought the walls around them belonged to them. They didn't knock. They didn't introduce anyone. They breezed in with coats half-zipped and boots wet with salt and snowmelt, tracking it across the rugs I had kept clean for years. I didn't rise to greet them. I stayed seated in my chair, blanket across my knees, newspaper folded in my lap. From that position, I watched as Brian shook hands, showed them around, pointed at fixtures and finishes like a salesman in a staged home. Cindy followed closely behind, her voice high and rehearsed, as she praised the natural light and cozy atmosphere. They used the word charm more than once. They said it with the sharpness of people who had never cared for the things they now praised. The couple was younger, early 40s maybe. The man had the kind of haircut that looked expensive and empty. The woman wore too much perfume and spoke like she was afraid of silence. I heard them ask about square footage. Brian answered with a number higher than I remembered. They laughed, nodded, and walked through the hallway toward the back bedrooms. No one looked at me, not directly. They glanced, the way people glance at an old portrait in a historic building, as if I were a fixture, something to note, and then forget. I was invisible and painfully present all at once. The next guests came 2 days later, then again on Sunday. By the second week, the visits became a pattern. Strangers entering my home, inspecting its bones, admiring its age like connoisseurs of antiques. Some spoke loudly, others whispered. Some smiled at me with pity, others avoided eye contact entirely. I was introduced only once by Cindy, who called me Dad, in the tone one uses to introduce a pet that might bite. Each time, they showed more of the house. They opened closets, peeked into drawers, touched the mantel, and commented on the vintage decor. I heard them guess at renovation costs, talk about open floor plans, consider tearing down my walls. One woman suggested the garage could be a fantastic yoga studio. Her husband agreed while standing in the exact spot where I had once rebuilt a '64 Mustang from nothing but rust and grit. Food started appearing in the kitchen after each visit. Cheese boards, finger sandwiches, bottles of wine. Cindy said they were gifts from interested parties. I knew better. These weren't gifts. These were rehearsals. This wasn't my home anymore. It was a showroom, and I was just a breathing liability they hadn't figured out how to explain away. They tried to compensate in strange ways. Cindy began leaving herbal teas by my chair, little glass jars with handwritten labels like relaxation and clarity. Brian ordered a subscription for magazines I didn't read and laid them on the coffee table in neat, untouched stacks. The television remote was programmed with new channels: real estate, design, health. I didn't touch any of it. Every gesture felt like an apology made without remorse. One afternoon, a woman with brittle blonde hair and sharp red nails sat beside me on the couch. She said she was a lifestyle consultant and that she just adored what the kids were doing with the space. She asked if I had considered living somewhere less stimulating. I said nothing. She took that as permission to keep talking. She said she worked with transitional families and that this phase of life was about honoring the past while letting go. I looked at her hands. She wore 4 rings. None of them were plain. After she left, I walked through the house alone. I counted how many things had changed without my consent. The dining room table was gone, replaced by a round glass one with chrome legs. The bookshelf in the hallway was now a minimal art piece, a single slab of wood with 1 plant and 3 color-coded hardcovers. Even the paintings on the wall had changed. They removed the one Martha painted the summer after her mother died. In its place hung a print of geometric shapes and meaningless color. Cindy told me they were just staging things, that it was temporary. I didn't respond. I simply walked into the guest room, the one they used as storage, and sat among the boxes. Inside were our old Christmas decorations, Martha's quilting supplies, photo albums, the flag from my brother's funeral, and a sealed envelope with my name written in my wife's handwriting. I didn't open it. Not yet. I just held it for a long while. The visits kept coming. The laughter grew louder, the voices more confident. I watched them host what they called a small gathering, which in truth looked like a networking event. There was wine and music and hors d'oeuvres I couldn't pronounce. I stayed in the garage that night. The door cracked open for air, my breath fogging in the cold. From outside, the house didn't look like mine anymore. The windows glowed with unfamiliar light, the laughter spilling out like smoke. I remembered something Jack once told me during a late-night patrol in Vietnam. He said, "People show their real face when they think no one's watching who matters." I hadn't understood what he meant then. I did now. These people weren't guests. They were vultures in tailored jackets, circling something they already believed was dead. But I wasn't dead. And I wasn't done. Let them play their parts. Let them sip wine and nod at the crown molding and speak in soft tones about lighting and resale value. I had worn a mask, too, once. Camouflage. And I knew how to disappear into the background until the moment came to move. They believed the house was already theirs. They forgot the man who built it still had the keys. It was the glass that gave them away. Not the kind that shatters or screams when broken, but the quiet kind. The kind that reflects rather than reveals. The kind you notice not by its sound, but by what's missing in its absence. That winter, my house became a maze of glass. Polished surfaces, reflective doors, gleaming shelves, shiny picture frames that framed nothing but trends. Everything that once absorbed warmth now bounced it away in cold, sterile brilliance. I first noticed it in the kitchen. The old ceramic mug I'd used for years was gone. In its place stood a neat row of matching glass cups, all identical, all spotless, all lifeless. They caught the light in a way that looked expensive and foreign. When I picked one up, it felt like holding a hollow idea, smooth, flawless, and utterly disconnected from anything human. My mug had been a little chipped, its handle uneven, its base stained from years of coffee, grief, and routine. But it had weight, memory. These new glasses had nothing but shine. The floor began to reflect too. Cindy had brought in some chemical polish that turned the hardwood into a mirror. Every step I took echoed now, not in sound, but in image. I could see the bottoms of my slippers, the sway of my robe, the hesitation in my gait. There was nowhere to hide from my reflection, and yet no one ever looked me in the eye. They saw the floors, but not the man walking on them. Then came the crystal figurines, shelf after shelf of them, deer, swans, a ballerina with arms poised above her head, frozen in a pirouette she would never complete. Cindy arranged them in perfect symmetry on the mantel and coffee table. When I sat in the living room, I could feel their glass eyes on me, judging me with the smug permanence of something that would outlast its owner. One morning, I found a shattered stem in the sink, what remained of one of the new wine glasses. No one mentioned it. But later that day, I saw Brian searching online for a matching set, not to fix what was broken, but to keep the appearance unblemished. I watched him do it from the hallway. I stood there, unseen, observing the way his finger hovered over the screen, how his lips moved silently as he read product descriptions. His expression was not one of guilt or nostalgia, or even curiosity. It was hunger, a kind of greed that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with image. I could see it now, as clear as the polished floor. He didn't want the house. He wanted what the house could say about him. They had started treating the place like a backdrop. Every corner, every surface had become a set for performance. The kitchen was staged with empty bowls of fruit. The bathroom smelled of artificial lavender. Even my bedroom, the one space I had begged them not to touch, now held 2 new bedside lamps made of frosted glass with bulbs that dimmed by remote. My old reading lamp, heavy brass, slightly tilted, was nowhere to be found. It was as if they were trying to erase anything that couldn't catch the light. The worst of it came when I opened the hallway closet. I had gone to retrieve my winter coat, the thick one with the canvas shell and worn cuffs, the one Martha had patched twice and called my second skin. It was gone. In its place hung a gray wool coat I didn't recognize, still with the tags on, its hanger glossy and curved like the racks in a department store. My boots were also missing, replaced with a pair of leather shoes I hadn't worn since a funeral 6 years ago. I stood there for several minutes, unmoving, not angry, not even surprised, just hollowed, like someone had scooped out something soft and private inside me and left the shell standing to see if it would collapse. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the halls instead, barefoot, slow, tracing the outline of what used to be mine. The glass shelves in the den reflected my silhouette back at me, elongated and distorted. I looked like a stranger in my own home. I touched the edges of the picture frames and saw fingerprints that weren't mine. I opened drawers and found organizers filled with neatly labeled compartments. My junk drawer, once a chaotic sanctuary of batteries, keys, old notes, and screws, was gone. In its place, plastic boxes full of order and silence. The next morning, I went out to the garage to breathe. My breath clouded the air in short, trembling bursts. I leaned on the workbench, palms flat against the wood, and looked up at the row of mason jars where I kept screws and bolts. They were dusty, mismatched, crooked. They had no shine, no label, and they felt like a cathedral. It was there that I noticed what else had disappeared. My pocket knife, the one I carried for 40 years, the one Martha gave me for our 10th anniversary with my initials etched into the handle. I kept it on a shelf above the bench, beside the tin box of old keys and a stack of warranty cards I never read. I checked twice. It wasn't there. I searched the drawers. I emptied the cabinets. I even checked under the floor mat in case it had fallen. Nothing. I walked back into the house, each step louder than the last. I didn't ask anyone. I didn't accuse. But that afternoon, Cindy came in smiling with a shopping bag and said, "Look what I found online, a modern replacement." It was silver, sleek, folded like a toy, the kind of knife people bought but never used. I took it, held it for a second, and placed it gently in the junk drawer that no longer existed. They didn't notice the difference, because to them, new was always better, glass was always cleaner, and reflection was more important than meaning. That evening, I watched as Brian uncorked a bottle of wine and poured 2 glasses, one for himself, one for a guest I didn't know. They toasted something I wasn't told about. They laughed. The glasses clinked, and the sound echoed like bells through a cathedral of lies. I saw a streak on one of the glasses, a fingerprint, just one. That was the moment I understood what was happening. Wasn't just renovation or inheritance, or even greed. It was subtraction, quiet and precise. Like a surgeon removing parts of a patient's body while he was still awake. They thought they were refining the house. But what they were really doing was erasing me, one reflection at a time. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning. No return address, just my name, handwritten in tight, careful letters across the front. The ink had bled slightly, like it had traveled a long way in uncertain weather. It was the only piece of mail in the box that day. Not a bill, not a flyer, not an advertisement or reminder from the clinic. Just that one envelope, thin and quiet, resting like a whisper among a silence that had grown loud in recent weeks. I brought it inside without ceremony. My fingers knew the texture of that handwriting before my eyes confirmed it. It was Jack's. I hadn't seen it in years, but the muscle memory remained. The way he curved his R's, the straight, stubborn lines of his capital H's. It was a writing style born in war, neat, efficient, legible in any weather, on any paper, in the dimmest light. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the kitchen table and made myself a cup of coffee first. I moved slower these days, partly because my joints demanded it, and partly because I had learned that time only rushes you when you let it. Outside the window, the last of the frost clung to the edge of the roof like an old soldier holding position. The house was quiet. Brian had taken the car. Cindy was out for groceries or errands or another trip to the showroom to price counters and faucets. The silence belonged to me again, for now. When I finally slit the envelope open, there was only a single page inside. No greeting, no sign-off, just 8 words, centered and scrawled in pencil. Got your letter. I'll do my part. Jack. That was all I needed. I folded the note and placed it in my shirt pocket. My hands felt steadier for the first time in weeks, my chest lighter. There was no warmth in those words, no flourish, no sentiment, just the kind of promise that comes from someone who's walked through fire beside you and come out the other side, carrying your wounded body. I trusted Jack, the way a man trusts only once in his life. We had exchanged our lives once, and now we were exchanging something else. Truth. That night, I went out to the garage again. I sat on the workbench and pulled out the old ledger I'd kept since the 80s. It was full of oil stains and torn edges, receipts taped and untaped, serial numbers scrawled in margins. But buried in the back pages, beneath a flap of duct tape, was the number I hadn't dialed in over a decade. Jack's landline. He never trusted cell phones. Said the signal was too easily lost, too easily traced. We had once used hand signals in the jungle. Now, we used the post. I didn't call him. I didn't need to. His letter was already a handshake, but I held that number in my hand for a long time, imagining his voice on the other end. Low, gravelly, and unchanging. The kind of voice that had never said more than it needed, but always said exactly enough. It took me back to the night I watched him drag Corporal Fields out of a crater under mortar fire. Jack had taken a piece of shrapnel through the thigh, bled through 2 tourniquets, and still didn't flinch until Fields was safe. I remembered thinking then that some men were carved from stone, not because they were hard, but because they were shaped by time and pain into something immovable. Jack was that kind of man. And now he held the truth of my life in his hands. I went back inside and sat in the living room, watching the shadows crawl across the ceiling as the day faded. The new chandelier, a recent addition I hadn't asked for, cast strange fractured patterns like broken glass across the walls. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the sound of Jack's boots on wet ground, the snap of twigs under our feet, the murmurs we shared between bursts of gunfire. He had once told me that the most dangerous kind of enemy was the one that smiled while stealing from you. I hadn't understood that then. I did now. The next day, I packed a small box. Inside it, I placed a few documents, copies of my driver's license, an old insurance statement, and a notarized letter naming Jack as my legal proxy. I added the real will, sealed and dated, with the lawyer's embossed stamp still visible in the corner. I wrapped everything in 2 layers of plain brown paper, tied it with twine, and placed it inside a weatherproof mailing case. Then I drove 2 towns over, to a post office where no one knew my name. I mailed the package with tracking and confirmation. I used cash. No signature required on the return. It would reach him in 3 days, maybe 4. Plenty of time. My body might have been slow, but my mind still ran like the engines I used to fix, stubborn and precise. When I returned home, no one asked where I'd been. Brian was on his laptop in the dining room, probably reviewing offers on a house that wasn't yet his. Cindy was on the phone again, pacing in the hallway, speaking in a voice that sounded sweet, but felt like vinegar. I walked past them like a ghost, like a man already gone. I made my way to my room, closed the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, staring at the floorboards. I thought about what it meant to leave something behind, not just a house or a car or a bank account, but a life, a shape in the world, a weight. They thought legacy was about money, but legacy wasn't what you handed down. It was what you refused to let them steal. The next morning, I stood in the driveway as the sun came up, watching the light touch the roof 1 shingle at a time. It was a cold sunrise, but it was mine. A neighbor waved. I nodded. I looked at the mailbox, the flag still down, and imagined the route Jack's envelope had taken across the miles, through snow, through sorting machines, through silent hands who never read what it carried. I smiled. I didn't need to fight them anymore. I had already spoken, and Jack had answered. My birthday arrived like a forgotten appointment, circled on someone else's calendar but distant and dull in my own mind. 77. The kind of number that sounded like the beginning of a countdown in the eyes of people already measuring your days. I hadn't planned to mark it. I hadn't mentioned it aloud. But they remembered. Of course they did. Not because they cherished the date, but because they needed an excuse to rehearse their version of devotion. They called it a celebration. That word used to mean something warm, like shared stories, quiet dinners, letters from people who remembered the sound of your voice. Now it felt like a press release, a manufactured event, something done, not out of love, but for optics, for image, a gesture curated for the world they imagined watching them, neighbors, friends, agents, potential buyers. The house was decorated by the time I came down that morning. Balloons, all metallic, hung on strings from the ceiling like surveillance devices. Streamers zigzagged across the hallway in unnatural symmetry. On the table sat a cake too large for 3 people, topped with glossy fruit and stiff white roses made from some kind of sugar compound I couldn't pronounce. The plates were gold plastic. The forks weren't metal. There was no coffee brewing, just sparkling water in tall flutes. I recognized none of it. It was a party for a stranger. Cindy greeted me with an exaggerated smile and a rehearsed tilt of her head. Brian stood behind her, clapping once with unnecessary force. They sang, not with warmth, but with tempo, and handed me a small flat box wrapped in shiny paper. Inside was a smartwatch. It blinked awake in my palm, tracking my pulse before I could even close my fingers around it. I placed it on the table and nodded, saying nothing. They snapped photos. So many photos. Brian propped up his phone against a vase and set it to record. Cindy adjusted my collar, patted my shoulder, laughed a little too loudly. She wiped at imaginary crumbs near my mouth, the way one might clean a child before a school play. They posed on either side of me for the camera, leaning in, smiling wide, gripping my arms like I might float away. I felt like an actor in a scene written without my input, a guest at my own wake. The gifts continued. A wool cardigan in a color I'd never wear, a framed digital photo slideshow of images I hadn't chosen, a scented candle labeled Memory Lane. They spoke about comfort and relaxation, words that sounded like cage doors closing softly. When I asked what time it was, Cindy said I didn't need to worry about time anymore. Brian raised a toast, sparkling cider in long glasses. His voice trembled in the way people's voices do when they pretend to be moved. He spoke about legacy, about everything you've built, Dad, and how grateful we are to carry your name forward. Cindy dabbed at the corner of her eye with a napkin. She didn't cry. She just wanted to be seen preparing to. They offered to play a video montage from the family. It was clearly something Cindy had pieced together. Stock music, old photographs from my youth, the occasional shaky clip of Martha, blurry and brief. Their children appeared once or twice in frames too perfect to be accidental. The whole thing lasted 6 minutes. 6 minutes to summarize a man's life. When it ended, they clapped. I did not. After the party, they posted it all online. I watched them do it, selecting filters, cropping the frames, crafting captions. Celebrating our incredible father today. A pillar, a hero, a legacy. The comments came fast. Friends of theirs, colleagues, even some distant cousins I hadn't heard from in decades, all typing the same hollow praises. So sweet. What a blessing. You're such good kids. I wondered what they'd say if they knew where the money for the cake had come from, if they saw the silent transactions labeled home staging, interior design consultation, pre-inspection. By the afternoon, they had moved on. Brian returned to his laptop. Cindy took a phone call in the backyard, pacing with intensity, whispering sharply. I was left in the living room, surrounded by the aftermath. Wrapping paper, deflated balloons, crumbs on the rug. The cake sat untouched except for the slice they cut for the camera. I placed it back in the fridge without tasting it. I took a walk that evening. The air outside was sharp but dry. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the snowbanks. I walked without purpose, just one foot in front of the other, my breath visible in bursts. At the end of the block, I stopped and looked back at the house. My house. Its windows glowed warm from the inside, but it no longer looked like a home. It looked like a rental, dressed up for showings. On the way back, I passed the neighbor boy, Max, shoveling his grandmother's sidewalk. He waved. I nodded. He didn't know it, but he was in the will. Not because I owed him anything, but because he had once brought my trash bins in during a storm and never asked for thanks. He did it because it was right. I never forgot that. Back inside, I returned to the garage. My hands found the envelope again, Jack's handwriting still intact, still waiting like a steady drumbeat beneath the chaos. I sat on the stool and read it again, though I didn't need to. The words had etched themselves into me. I placed the letter back in its place and looked around at the shelves, the tools, the jars, the dust. Everything still carried the scent of oil and time. This room hadn't been touched. They had no interest in what they couldn't polish. Later that night, they knocked on my door and asked if I wanted to watch a movie with them. Something new, they said. Something light-hearted. I declined. They didn't insist. They never did when the cameras weren't rolling. As I lay in bed, I thought about the way Cindy had touched my shoulder during the party, the way Brian had refilled my glass without looking at me. Their kindness was real only so far as it was visible. Like stage lights on a dark set, it only illuminated what they wanted others to see. They believed that love could be constructed, arranged, displayed. But real love never needed to be witnessed. Real love didn't come in glass frames or digital slideshows or perfectly timed captions. Real love stayed in the handwritten note, in the silence of an old friend's promise, in the room they never stepped into, and in the parts of me They never asked to know. It began with papers on the counter, a neat stack of white sheets held together by a silver clip. I found them early one morning, just after sunrise, while the house was still heavy with the kind of silence that only follows a well-rehearsed lie. The smell of coffee was in the air, but no one had brewed it. The papers lay precisely placed, centered on a navy blue folder with my name printed in bold on a sticky note. I didn't touch them at first. I stood there, staring, my breath barely audible over the refrigerator hum. There was something surgical in the way they were arranged. Too perfect, too intentional. I knew the language they'd be written in even before I read a word. Polite phrases built to obscure meaning, legal scaffolding designed to hold up greed. It wasn't the first time I'd seen betrayal dressed in courtesy. Eventually, I sat down and read them line by line. The words said one thing, but my gut told me another. They spoke of streamlining, of delegated authority, of ease of transition. It was all wrapped in the comforting language of care. But it wasn't about care. It was about control. The documents granted Brian and Cindy full financial power over my assets, my home, my future, my name. There was a space for my signature at the bottom of each page, a waiting line, a doorway through which they hoped I'd walk without hesitation. A trap, not of malice, but of expectation. They thought I would sign because I always had, because I'd been quiet, because I'd allowed them to take and spend and smile without confrontation, because they believed silence meant consent. Later that day, Brian approached me in the dining room, pretending not to see the papers. He asked how I was feeling, said he noticed I'd been a little tired lately. Cindy chimed in not long after, suggesting that maybe it was time to start thinking about help. They smiled the whole time, polished, patient, insistent. They had practiced this moment, likely more than once. I was simply a cue in their script. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I didn't even answer. I nodded like an old man who had lost the will to resist, and that seemed to satisfy them. Cindy patted my shoulder. Brian squeezed my arm. They called me strong, wise, practical. They told me how grateful they were that I was willing to take steps early. Every word they spoke was soaked in irony they couldn't hear. That night, I took the papers to the garage. I laid them on the workbench beneath the old swing-arm lamp Martha used to call my second son. I examined each paragraph again, using the same concentration I had once used to read topographic maps in the field, the same patience I'd used to rebuild carburetors with parts scavenged from junkyards. By the time I reached the last page, my hands were steady. My thoughts were not clouded. My eyes were not weak. I saw everything for what it was. I took out my own copy of the real will, the one Jack had now, the one with my signature, notarized in ink on a Tuesday afternoon over 2 years ago, in a lawyer's office an hour from home. I ran my fingers over the seal, the embossing still crisp against the paper. My name stood at the top, but the beneficiaries were not Brian or Cindy. They were not the ones who had buried Martha. They were not the ones who had stayed with me in the hospital, who had sat through the long, sleepless nights of recovery. They had simply waited, patiently, calculatingly. The next morning, I returned the folder to the kitchen counter. The papers remained unsigned. I placed them exactly as I had found them, but this time, I added something of my own. A note. Just one sentence, written in my own hand, with the same blue ink I had used to sign the true will. I read every word. I didn't hear any reaction. They didn't confront me. They didn't question the note. But I noticed the difference. Brian stayed quiet during dinner. Cindy left the dishes in the sink. Their silence was not the same as mine. Mine was weighted. Theirs was hollow, defensive. There was a new stiffness in their posture, a caution in their glances. They knew I had seen through it, but they still believed they had time. 2 days later, they tried again. This time, it was Cindy who brought the folder. She found me in the den, sitting in the recliner I hadn't replaced, the one they said looked out of place now. She smiled too softly. Her tone was slower, almost sad. She placed the folder gently on the armrest and said, "We just want to be prepared." I didn't speak. I didn't move. She left the room quietly. I waited until evening. I took the folder outside and placed it in the trash bin, not the recycling. I made sure it went in with the food scraps and coffee grounds and the paper towels soaked in window cleaner. I watched it disappear under the weight of ordinary waste. Then I walked back to the garage and pulled out the envelope Jack had sent. I read his short note again. "Got your letter. I'll do my part." That promise was stronger than any signature. It meant something in a way the folder never could. That weekend, Brian came home with a man in a suit. I saw them from the window, standing near the garage, talking in hushed tones. The man had a clipboard. He pointed at the side of the house, at the gutters, at the landscaping. Brian nodded, occasionally checking his phone. They didn't see me watching. They never did. On Monday, a car pulled into the driveway, an appraiser. She stayed for 40 minutes, took photos, asked questions, walked the perimeter like a scout. When she left, she didn't say goodbye. I wasn't surprised. This was the next phase. The signature they wanted had not been for help or care. It had been permission to erase me. They still believed the old will was real. They believed in the version of the world they had constructed with receipts and projections and catalogs. But my life was not a column on a spreadsheet. My worth was not measured by square footage or resale potential. My worth was in the man who held the envelope, in the truth he would protect, the truth they would never see coming. It happened on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of morning when the sky forgets to brighten and everything outside looks like it's been muted. The clouds hung so low they seemed to press against the rooftops. The wind didn't blow, the birds didn't sing, and the world felt like it was waiting for something. I sat by the window in the front room with my coffee, watching the driveway like I had every day for the past few weeks. But that day, I saw something new. A white SUV pulled in slowly, clean and modern, too polished for anyone in the neighborhood. A man stepped out, bald, dressed in a black peacoat, holding a leather folder under one arm. He looked like he hadn't slept. He moved with a sense of calm authority, the kind you learn to recognize after years of watching people who get paid to control situations. I didn't know his name, but I knew his type. Legal, professional, unsentimental. Brian came out from the side of the house a few seconds later, waving. They shook hands at the base of the steps, and then Brian ushered him inside. I heard the door open, close, and the low murmur of voices moving into the dining room. I didn't rise. I didn't need to. I already knew why they were here. From my chair, I saw Cindy appear in the hallway. She was dressed neatly, hair done, makeup subtle but deliberate. She carried herself like someone who was trying not to appear eager. Her heels tapped softly across the floor as she went to the kitchen, probably preparing tea or coffee to serve, a formality she'd likely practiced. The energy in the house changed. They weren't pretending anymore. This was it. I stayed out of the way, moving through the house like smoke. I walked to the back door, stepped out onto the porch, and circled the yard slowly, letting the cold air bite at my fingers. My boots left fresh prints in the thin frost across the deck. I moved along the side of the house, past the rose bed that had been neglected since Martha died, around to the front, until I stood at the top of the driveway. From there, I looked through the window and saw them seated around the table, heads tilted toward the folder on the table between them. That folder, that symbol, that final step. The man in the coat opened it and began laying out documents. Brian leaned in, nodding, occasionally pointing. Cindy sat with her hands folded, occasionally lifting one to tuck her hair behind her ear. The lawyer, if that's what he was, flipped pages with practiced fingers. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His role wasn't to explain. It was to confirm. I stood there for a long while, unseen, just outside the frame of their world. My breath fogged the window pane as I looked in. The house they sat in was mine, but the future they planned wasn't. They believed they were at the end of a story, the part where the ink dries and the paper is passed across the table with smiles and a handshake. They didn't know they were reading the wrong script. I walked back to the garage and opened the cabinet beneath the old radio. Inside was a small black binder. I pulled it out and placed it on the workbench. It held the most recent banking statements, the notarized letter of revocation for the old power of attorney, and a sealed copy of the real will, identical to the one Jack held. I flipped it open, checked the date again, read the signatures, and then closed it with care. I didn't need to bring it into the house. Not yet. That moment would come on its own. The doorbell rang an hour later. I had just stepped into the hallway when I heard it. A short chime, polite and sterile. I moved toward the front door, but Brian got there first. He opened it with a smooth, practiced motion. Standing on the porch was a second man, this one older, dressed in jeans and a leather jacket, his beard silver and his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. He carried no folder. He held nothing but a plain envelope in one hand and a quiet look that said he had driven far without stopping. It was Jack. He looked past Brian and saw me. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply raised the envelope slightly, the way we used to raise our hands in the field. No sound, no announcement, just clarity. Brian turned, confused, and looked back at me, but I had already begun walking forward. I opened the storm door and stepped onto the threshold. The moment didn't need explanation. Cindy appeared in the hallway, her expression tightening the instant she saw Jack. She didn't recognize him, of course. To her, he was just a stranger. But she understood something had shifted. The air grew heavier, the silence sharper. The lawyer stood behind them both, unsure of what to say. Jack held out the envelope. I took it without a word. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was final. Inside the envelope was a brief statement, legally certified, declaring that Jack Milner had been named as the executor of my estate, as per a revised will filed over 2 years ago. His copy was already lodged with the proper authorities. His signature was on every line that mattered. And mine, right beside it. I didn't open it in front of them. I didn't need to. Brian stepped forward, saying something I didn't bother to register. Cindy's voice rose slightly, somewhere between confusion and outrage. The lawyer began to ask a question. I raised a hand, not to stop them, but to end the conversation before it started. This wasn't a negotiation. It was the truth. Jack stepped back off the porch and turned without another word. He didn't linger. He didn't wait for thanks. He got into his truck and drove away, the tires crunching over the gravel, the engine fading into the morning air. I stood there, the envelope still in my hand, and looked at my children. Brian's face was red, not with shame, but with disbelief. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Cindy crossed her arms, her mouth pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting from me to the papers on the dining room table, as if trying to figure out how the story had changed without her noticing. I stepped back into the house and shut the door behind me. The porch was now empty, but the silence that filled the room was different than before. It wasn't my silence. It was theirs. They had filled the house with voices, with plans, with designs and intentions. And now all of it had stopped, not because I had raised my voice, but because I had never needed to. The truth had simply knocked, and I had opened the door. The letter arrived on a Monday. Not in the mail, but by courier, hand-delivered, signed for, time-stamped. The envelope was thick, the seal embossed, the paper cream-colored and heavy. It bore the insignia of a law office I knew well, one I had visited twice in the last year, both times alone and without mention to anyone else. The woman who handled my file was polite, precise, and efficient. She had asked no questions beyond what the forms required. She had looked me in the eye when I signed the final page and said, "If this ever needs to move forward, we will do so without hesitation." Now, it was moving forward. The courier, a young man in a windbreaker, handed me the envelope without ceremony. He didn't wait. He turned and left as soon as I closed the door behind me. I stood in the front hall for a moment, listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then I opened the envelope and read the first line of the letter. "The execution of the revised will is now active." I folded the letter and placed it on the table next to the lamp Martha had bought at a flea market in Ohio 30 years ago. I stood there a while, staring at that lamp. It still worked, though the shade was cracked, and the base leaned slightly to the left. Cindy had tried to replace it once with something sleeker. I told her no, not because I cared about the lamp, but because I needed one thing, just one, to remain untouched. By noon, the calls had begun. Not to me, to them. The lawyer had followed protocol exactly. Notifications were issued to all named parties, including those omitted from the revised will. That meant Brian and Cindy received formal letters, hand-delivered to them as well, outlining the change in status. They were no longer beneficiaries. They were no longer executors. They were no longer part of anything they had so confidently built in their minds. The estate had been rerouted, the house reassigned, the accounts frozen pending full transfer to the designated entities. Their names, once bold on the old documents, were now footnotes. I didn't go downstairs when I heard Cindy's voice rise. She spoke rapidly, her words stacking like firewood, each one sharper than the last. Brian shouted once, a single guttural bark of disbelief. Then silence. Then footsteps. Then the sound of papers rustling violently, as if shaking them might change what they said. The knock came at my bedroom door not long after. I didn't answer. I remained seated at the edge of the bed, hands resting on my knees, eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the trees were bare, their limbs black against the pale sky. A crow stood on the fence, its head tilted. It didn't move. Eventually, the knocking stopped. By evening, they were gone. I heard them packing, drawers slammed, cabinets opened and closed, boxes dragged across floors. Cindy spoke in fragments, half-formed sentences, muttered curses, disbelief slipping into fury. Brian said less. He moved with the speed of someone who had been caught unprepared. I knew that walk. I'd seen it in soldiers before, men who underestimated the moment and found themselves standing in its aftermath, unsure of how they'd lost control. I stayed in my room until the sound of the front door opening reached me. It hung there for a second, followed by footsteps on the porch, then silence. When I finally stepped into the hallway, the air felt different. Lighter, but not warmer, like the vacuum left behind after a storm has passed. I walked through the house slowly, passing through each room, taking note of what was missing. The photos had been taken off the walls, the ones with Brian and Cindy, their children, their vacations, their milestones. Spaces remained where the frames had been, lighter rectangles against darker paint. The guest room was stripped bare, the bed left unmade, the closet empty. In the kitchen, the new glassware was gone, along with the sleek appliances they had installed. The house looked older now, more tired, but more honest. On the dining room table, I found a single sheet of paper, not a note, not an apology, just a list, a crude inventory of items they believed were theirs. Beside each line, they had written the word taken or left. There were no thank yous, no farewells, just possession. I opened the cabinet where I kept the keys. Inside was a small manila envelope with my name written in pencil. I opened it and found 3 identical house keys. Duplicates I hadn't seen in years. They'd returned them. Not out of respect, I assumed, but because they understood now they had no legal claim. The house was no longer a question of proximity or inheritance. It had become something they couldn't touch. The locks were changed the next morning. I called a locksmith before dawn. He arrived just after 8, a man my age with sunburnt hands and a quiet professionalism. He didn't ask why I wanted every lock on the property replaced. He simply got to work. By noon, the front, back, and garage doors had all been fitted with new mechanisms. I held the keys in my hand, fresh metal, unmarked, without history. I slid one onto my ring and placed the others in the top drawer of the hallway desk. I didn't expect them to return, but I knew people like Brian and Cindy didn't walk away cleanly. They circled back when the shock wore off, hoping for negotiation, for some thread of the old power to remain. They would test the door eventually, and when they did, it would not open. That evening, I sat on the front porch with a blanket over my knees, watching the sky fade to a deep steel gray. The wind had picked up. The oak tree in the yard groaned under the weight of its own age. I thought about Martha, about how she would have handled this. She had always been gentler, more forgiving. But even she had understood the limits of grace. Inside the house, everything sounded different. No footsteps upstairs, no soft tapping of fingers against glass screens, no muffled conversations behind closed doors, just the hum of the furnace, the creak of old wood, and the occasional sigh of the walls settling into their truest shape. I made myself dinner that night, just a sandwich, some soup. I ate at the table alone, with the letter from the lawyer folded beside my plate. I didn't reread it. I didn't need to. The words had already done their work. They had severed the old expectations. They had returned the house to me, not as a possession, but as a place where silence no longer meant surrender. As I washed the dishes, I glanced at the front door. The new lock gleamed in the dim light. The door was still mine, and this time, it stayed closed. The days that followed were quiet in a way I had forgotten was possible. Not the quiet of waiting or uncertainty, but the kind that wraps itself around you like an old quilt, worn, familiar, undemanding. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for anything, doesn't watch you from behind a phone screen, doesn't pace the hallway waiting for a yes. This silence didn't need my attention. It simply existed, and I let it stay. For the first time in months, the house belonged to itself. The air settled. The rooms, though bare in places, felt more honest than they had in years. There were empty walls where pictures used to hang, and the corners still held dust where furniture had been dragged away. But I didn't mind. The imperfections spoke louder than the curated designs ever had. I no longer felt the pressure to perform. I didn't have to explain how I was feeling, what I was thinking, or why I wasn't smiling. I woke each morning before the sun. My body had long kept its own time, and now that no one was watching me for signs of deterioration, I could move through my routines without scrutiny. I made coffee in my old percolator, the one with the chipped handle that Cindy had tried to throw away twice. I sat in the kitchen in the early dark, listening to the drip and hiss of the brew, watching the sky lighten through the window. There were no more surprise visitors, no more calls asking about my medications, my blood pressure, my estate. The phone rang once, a robocall from a carpet cleaning service. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't check the message. Every now and then, I'd receive a letter from the bank or a statement from the foundation. The new arrangements were working. The funds were being dispersed according to the updated will. The vocational school in Martha's name had sent a thank you note with a photograph of students working on engines. I stared at it, longer than I thought I would. Young hands stained with oil, heads bent in concentration. They reminded me of myself at that age. Eager, focused, believing that if you turned the right bolt, the world might start running smoothly again. One afternoon, I opened the garage door and let the cold air sweep through. I spent hours reorganizing the shelves. No one interrupted me. No one hovered or asked if I needed help. I worked slowly, my joints creaking like old hinges, but I finished every task I set for myself. I cleaned the old tools, labeled drawers, threw away the things that no longer served a purpose. It was a ritual, more than anything. A way of touching the life I had built with my own hands and reminding myself it still held meaning. I found a small box beneath the workbench, one I hadn't opened since the year Martha died. Inside were postcards she had collected over the years, never sent, just saved. Places we never went, cities we talked about and forgot. Some had single words scribbled on the back: someday, maybe, next year. I ran my fingers over the edges and placed them back in the box, not out of sadness, but respect. Some things didn't need to be finished. They just needed to be remembered. When the sun dipped behind the trees each evening, I made a habit of sitting on the porch again. The wind had changed by then, less sharp, more settled. It carried the smell of earth beneath the frost, a hint of spring still months away, but not impossible. I watched as the light drained from the sky, not with dread, but with patience. I no longer feared the dark. I thought often of the phrase Cindy had once used, peace of mind. She had said it like it was a product, something you could buy and wrap and deliver to someone like a gift. But peace of mind doesn't come in a pill bottle or a trust fund. It doesn't arrive with notarized documents or new appliances. It comes in the form of knowing you are finally allowed to be unremarkable, to live without being managed, measured, or mined for value. I spent more time in the attic, going through boxes I'd avoided for years, letters from my father, receipts from our first house. The service flag folded into that perfect triangle, its edges soft now, the creases not as sharp as they once were. I didn't cry. I didn't linger. I simply sat with it all. I let the weight of it rest on me like a hand on the shoulder, familiar and firm, not pushing, not pulling, just there. On a particularly still morning, I visited the cemetery. I hadn't gone in months, not because I didn't care, but because the last few times I'd gone, it felt performative, with someone watching, asking questions, needing to be part of it. This time, I drove alone. I brought a single daffodil. The ground was still too hard to dig, so I laid it gently on the grave and brushed the snow off the marker. I sat on the bench nearby and spoke aloud, though not much. Just enough. I told her the house was quiet again, that the garage was clean, that I'd finally fixed the back gate. I told her about the letter from the school, about the crow on the fence, about the silence. I told her they were gone. I told her they wouldn't be back. Driving home, the sun broke through the clouds just for a moment, casting a sliver of gold across the frozen fields. I turned the heat up in the truck and rolled the window down for just a few seconds, letting the cold air hit my face. It felt good. Real. I was still here. That night, I lit a fire in the living room. The wood cracked and hissed as it burned. I sat nearby, wrapped in an old quilt, holding a book I had read twice before, and would read again. The house didn't creak that night. The wind didn't howl. No one called. No one knocked. And in that space, I finally heard it. The silence they could never buy. The silence that belonged only to me. It was early when I rose that morning, not out of habit, not because of pain, and not because of dreams. I rose because something inside me said it was time. The house was still dark, the kind of pre-dawn quiet that stretches long and slow like an old limb waking. I didn't turn on the light. I moved through the hallway with memory instead of sight, touching the edges of walls and furniture like old friends I'd grown up beside. My feet knew every creak in the floor, every uneven board, every nailhead that had lifted over the decades. The house responded to my steps with gentle murmurs, as if it too knew that today marked something final. I dressed without rush, a wool sweater, a pair of clean slacks, heavy boots. I buttoned my coat all the way to the collar and reached for my gloves, not because the weather demanded it, but because I wanted to feel the full weight of the ritual. I moved to the back door and paused. The sun had not yet risen, but the sky had begun its shift from black to deep blue. That first suggestion of light, thin, almost hesitant, was enough to show me the frost on the porch railing and the stiff breath of the trees standing silent against the horizon. I stepped outside. The cold didn't bite. It held me, not with hostility, but with respect. The air felt like something earned. Each breath left my body slowly, like smoke rising from a steady fire. I walked down the steps one at a time, not for balance, but because I wanted to feel each descent. My boots crunched against the path leading to the side yard, where the old oak stood bare and immovable. I circled the house once, not inspecting, not judging, just witnessing. The siding needed paint. The gutters sagged in one corner. A shutter hung loose on the south-facing window. These were not failures. They were artifacts. Every house that has lived long enough gathers its wounds, and like me, it wore them without apology. When I reached the front yard, I stopped. There was no music, no speech, no audience, just the sky turning lighter and the breath in my lungs. I began to walk down the street. I didn't have a destination, not exactly, but the march had begun, and I knew I would follow it wherever it led. My legs, though slower now, carried me with the steadiness of a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to chase. The neighborhood was asleep, curtains drawn, driveways empty, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with everything unspoken over the years, everything I had let go, everything I had endured, everything I had prepared for. I passed the old schoolyard. The swings creaked in the wind, chains rusted, seats stiff with cold. I remembered pushing Brian on one of them, decades ago, before he ever learned to lie with a smile. His legs had flailed with joy back then. That memory didn't hurt. It simply existed. Further down, I passed the church where Martha and I had once stood hand in hand, too young to know what decades would look like. The bricks were the same. The cross above the bell tower still caught the light first. I didn't stop. I only bowed my head once as I passed. I walked for an hour, maybe more. The sun rose behind me, casting long shadows that stretched ahead, as if even the day was acknowledging my presence. No cars passed. No dogs barked. The world allowed me this time. I reached the edge of the town where the road split, one path toward the highway, the other winding back home. I stood there, hands in my coat pockets, and looked out across the open fields. The frost glistened across the tall grass. The silence was total, and in it I heard the truth of everything that had passed. I was not angry. I was not bitter. What they tried to take from me, they never truly understood, and what I kept, they never saw. They had measured my life in numbers, in square footage, in projected value. They had seen my hands and called them old, seen my silence and called it weakness, seen my solitude and called it vulnerability. But they had not seen the soldier who still lived in my spine. They had not seen the man who rebuilt engines with bare hands in the dead of winter. They had not seen the quiet oath I made in the jungle with a man who never broke his word. They had seen the house, but they had never seen the man who built it. I turned and made my way back, retracing my steps, each one slower than the last. The sun was higher now, the air softer. A neighbor waved as he backed out of his driveway. I nodded. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Back home, I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. The click of the latch echoed like a period at the end of a long sentence. I removed my coat, hung it by the door, and stood for a moment in the front room. The light filtered in through the blinds, catching on the dust that danced in the still air. Everything was exactly where I had left it. I sat in my chair, not to rest, but because the march had ended, and I was exactly where I was meant to be, not claimed, not controlled, but present, alive, and free.